All right, our next speaker is Dr. Willet Boyer. Willet is a member of ARI, and we'll welcome him to the podium. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to get rid of this. Here we go.
Thank you. Let's see, can everybody hear me? Okay, very good. Before I begin my own talk, I would say it was very, very interesting to hear what Andrew said when I was working on my master's thesis in St. Augustine, looking at the Bartram records. It's pretty clear there that you've got what he called Yamasee captives living with cowkeepers. So I think that, you know, it's excellent to see that there's being research done in that area. The theme of the conference is old stories, new discoveries. What I would like to talk about is the application of certain techniques. Some of them have been around for a while in archaeology, but they've been refined and are being applied in new ways to the study of the late pre-contact, the protohistoric and early contact periods here. What I'd like to do, first of all, is kind of define our terms. When we're talking about studies of the protohistoric and early contact period, we're dealing with a situation where we're looking at sites, not necessarily sites that have European components, but sites that date to the period after the discovery of the Americas by Europeans in 1492, up to the time when you actually have permanent Spanish colonization in the southeast in 1565. The issue with studying those types of sites, particularly sites that can be defined as protohistoric, and I want to be a little more specific using the term protohistoric. When I'm thinking of a protohistoric site, it's a site that can be definitely shown to have been occupied during the period of time we're talking about, but that does not have evidence of European presence. In other words, it's a site that we can firmly date to the period after the European discovery of the Americas in 1492, but doesn't have any type of European artifacts associated with it. A true early contact site, in the definition that I'm using here in this talk, is a site that does have evidence of 16th century European materials present, particularly early 16th century materials that are clearly prior to the time, again, of the colonization of the southeast, the founding of St. Augustine, and permanent Spanish settlement here. Now, understanding these sites is critical if we're going to have any way of knowing what was going on truly during this period. If we want to understand the impacts of European disease and colonialism, if we want to understand exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about population drop-off in certain areas, if we want to see the changes that are taking place in settlement patterns or in the sizes of populations, we have first to be able to firmly date sites that exist in this period of time when these massive changes in population were taking place, and you see the demographic shifts and the effects of European contact first begin. We also ideally would like to be able to look at what kind of resources people are using during this or any other period, but here in particular, with population drop-off, with the documented changes that you see in ceramics after the time of European contact, particularly later on with the rise of the mission era, it's helpful to have some idea about how and where people are manufacturing these items that you've got in the archaeological record. Now that's where the techniques that I'm going to be talking about here come in. Recently, with the Aucilla Research Institute's Wakulla Springs project, we've had the opportunity to apply new form of OSL dating, rather than dating of sediments, dating of ceramics, as well as XRF analysis of ceramics, to the sites that we've been working at. And I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the insights that we've gotten from doing so. So let's take a look at the area that we're talking about. Of course, here highlighted is where we are now, Jefferson County, and immediately to the west, you've got Wakulla County and Leon County. And the sites that we're going to be talking about, with a couple of exceptions, are going to be located in this region. They're going to be located at Wakulla Springs, They're going to be located in Leon County and Jefferson County in this region between the rivers. Now, for the past 3 years, I've had the opportunity to serve as the historical archaeologist, one of the co-principal investigators of ARI's Wakulla Springs project, working with Jim Dunbar the last year or so with Andy Hemmings. And we've been doing work at the site cluster at Wakulla Springs. And of course, from the perspective of the very, very ancient sites, we're looking not just at the terrestrial sites, the underwater sites. The sites that I'm going to be talking about, however, date to the other end of time, the period that I normally work with. Let's take a look here. These sites are sites, some of which were recorded before we began doing work in this area in 2016, some of which we have recorded since then. I'll point them out. The area that you just saw, of course, is the Wakulla Springs Lodge site, which is immediately beside the main spring head here. The other sites we're going to be looking at are the Moai Rock site, which is north of that, both on the other side of the main spring head and on the other side of Sally Ward Spring Run. The Bear site and the Childs Mound site, which are to the east down in the area they call the Preserve. And a bit further east here, the Waters Hill site, 8WA1221. There are two other sites here that are marked on the map that also have a Fort Walton component, an unnamed site, 8WA330, and the no-name spring site. But we'll be focusing primarily on the sites that are in this cluster here. Now, OSL dating is a technique that has been used primarily until recently to date sediments. OSL is valuable as it has gotten increasingly refined. I can remember when I was a grad student, there was a lot of question about how accurate it was. The technique has been improved considerably to the point where dating of sediments can be done with reasonable accuracy for older sites. What's interesting is that OSL can also be used to date ceramics. Now, that's a valuable technique to have, because if you're talking about, for example, European ceramics, or you're talking about ceramics that don't have any type of associated organic content where you can't get a good radiocarbon date, you can get a reasonably accurate date, defined as a date within a few decades of the time that the material was actually deposited, by using OSL. John Worth of the University of West Florida, and John will be here speaking a little bit later on this afternoon, and I have collaborated for a number of years ever since he was my doctoral committee chair. And John had let Jim and I know that they had used OSL dating on ceramics from the Luna settlement site in Pensacola and gotten very good results. Luna is known to have been there between 1559 and 1561, so we've got an accurate date about when the site was actually occupied. John also, in testing OSL dates against radiocarbon dates with associated organic material, has gotten very good correspondence between the OSL dates from the ceramics and the radiocarbon dates from deposits in the same area. So overall, OSL dating of ceramics is an increasingly accurate and useful technique, and we decided that we were going to apply it to certain ceramics at Wakulla Springs. In particular here, the questions that we wanted to answer with the Fort Walton sites at Wakulla Springs are these actually separate sites? Are they sites that were occupied at different times, don't have anything to do with each other? Or are they in fact part of a single larger site that was occupied at the same time? And if so, or if the dates show a sequence, what can those dates tell us about what was actually going on at this site cluster in this area? We decided, Jim and I, to take a look at ceramics that were coming from, on this map, the Bear site, 8WA321, the Childs Mound site, 8WA309, and the Moai Rock site. When we were doing work here, the Waters Hill site was found to also be a Fort Walton site with some later Fort Walton ceramics, including Point Washington incised and Lamar ceramics. And we're looking at Childs Mound. Childs Mound, when the site was originally surveyed back in 1988 by Stephen Brine, Brine assigned it to the Weeden Island period, and it was apparently initially constructed then. But when I had the opportunity to look at the collections that were on file at the Bureau of Archaeological Research, it was pretty clear looking at them that some of those ceramics weren't Weeden Island ceramics. At least some of them were Fort Walton ceramics, Lake Jackson plain, Lake Jackson incised. The Moai rock site north of the Springhead, we found during the course of post-hole testing in 2016 in that area. Moai rock appears to be a ritual site. Susan Goodhope, I see, is going to be talking later on about her techniques, but based on some of what she found, there is a distinct possibility that it is a burial area cemetery. We found it initially by seeing ceramics in one area on the ground surface, and testing there showed that it also is a site that has a late Fort Walton component. So the question is, in this site cluster, are we looking at a single occupation, or are we looking at different occupations at different times, and if so, when? Now, OSL dating of ceramics works in the same way as OSL dating of sediments. Essentially, it is a method of dating the material by measuring the paleo dose of light of energy that the sample received against a control of sediment from the same layer, the same area where the material was recovered from. And in the course of having these sediments dated, we decided to use purely Fort Walton materials. We did send off some European materials from the Wakulla Springs Lodge site for dating, and a couple of others. Here I'm going to be talking about the Fort Walton, the Native American materials. The Childs Mound site here, because of the Weeden Island component, was particularly intriguing. I wanted to find out in the course of doing the work at Wakulla whether or not this site was purely Weeden Island, or if what I was seeing in the collection was accurate, and it was occupied later as well. We had a bit of misfortune, of course, with Hurricane Michael, but from an archaeological perspective, it provided the opportunity to get new materials from the site also, because several trees were uprooted. And while we did not do excavations there, we did some salvage work. We treated the area where these tree falls happened. We had 3 occur on the mound surface. One of them in particular is excavation units, cleaned and screened all of the loose sediment, profiled the walls just as you would a larger unit, and got recovered materials which were part of our study. At Waters Hill, unfortunately, we did not have the opportunity to include the dates there, but the materials here were very similar to what we were seeing at the other sites. We have late Fort Walton materials like the Point Washington incised you see here on the left, and the Lamar complicated stamp that you see here on the right. So the materials that we had dated came from the Childs Mound site, from Brine's 1988 collection, and from the Moai rock site that we had excavated in, or not excavated, excuse me, had tested in 2016. And materials from 8WA321, the Bear site. The Bear site was particularly important because when Calvin Jones did the initial testing there in the 90s, in addition to the Native American ceramics, he also found fragments of early style olive jar. So that site is not just a protohistoric site, it appeared to have an early contact component. We were really interested to see what the dates were going to tell us about each of these sites, and this table shows the results. From Childs Mound, the one that we knew we had a Weeden Island component, the 2 materials that were definitely Fort Walton, Lake Jackson plain, Lake Jackson incised, we got back dates of AD 1179 plus or minus 86 years, and 1210 plus or minus 84 years. So indeed they were later than the Weeden Island period and appeared to be associated with the Fort Walton culture. But here we're talking about a period that's at least 3 centuries before European contact. The piece of Lamar complicated stamp that we had dated from the Bear site, and remember, this is the site that Calvin Jones actually found the early style olive jar, returned a date of 1537 AD, plus or minus 42 years. And from the Moai rock site, we got a range, if you will, of dates. The dates that we got: an older piece of grog-tempered punctated ceramics dated to 1355, plus or minus 60 years. The late date that we got off of a piece of Point Washington incised was AD 1600, plus or minus 64 years. And again, here we're dealing with a situation where these dates are within a range of decades rather than centuries. So we've got a little bit tighter idea about when some of these sites were occupied. Now, what makes this intriguing is that this gives us a basis for hypothesizing a little bit of cultural behavior. And at the close of my talk, I'll talk more about that. But I want you to bear in mind we're looking at a situation here where at least two of these sites then do in fact appear to have a component that dates to the Protohistoric period, potentially to the early contact period, given the fact that you also have European materials at the Bear site. And you're seeing a definite Fort Walton occupation, or at least activity at the site in the Fort Walton period, not just the Weeden Island component that Brian had thought the site dated to. Now, another technique that we employed in, one moment. It's frozen up on me. Let's see if we can get this to move forward just a wee bit. Just a moment. One thing I do want to mention before talking about our analysis with pXRF is this find also from the Childs Mound site. Anybody in the audience who's a historical archaeologist will recognize that's not Weeden Island, that is Mission Red filmed. And immediately beside it is a blue glass European bead. And that will play into our understanding of what was taking place at this site cluster through time. Now, another technique that has been around for a bit in archaeology, but has some interesting implications for understanding what's going on in this period of time, is the use of XRF, X-ray fluorescence analysis. X-ray fluorescence is valuable because it lets you pull out the elemental signature, the composition of the different types of materials that an artifact of any kind is made from. The technique works by bombarding the artifact essentially with a very high dose of strong X-rays, and you're getting secondary radiation coming from it. That secondary radiation allows you to pick out different elements of the elemental signature. I decided it really truly did not like what I had there. Anybody have any idea? I'd like to be able to show the scattergrams if we can. John actually performed XRF analysis for us. The University of West Florida has their analyzer, portable X-ray fluorescence, or pXRF. The analysis was done for comparison on multiple samples or assemblages from different areas. We looked at the elemental composition of the ceramics from the Fort Walton sites that we just talked about in the Wakulla site cluster. However, we also pulled materials.
Well, the laptop's back. Hopefully it'll sync up.
All right. Just one moment. And I would like to be able to show you some of what our results were. But the sites that we're going to be talking about are not just the ones that we were just looking at in the Wakulla site cluster. Everybody here from this area is probably familiar with the Governor Martin site, the headquarters of the Florida Bureau of Archaeological Research. For the purposes of doing XRF analysis, we looked at the composition of materials from the Wakulla Springs site. We looked at the materials, Fort Walton materials that were associated with the Governor Martin site. We looked at a sample of Fort Walton ceramics from the Aucilla Research Institute's Tall Timbers collection from a site called the Williams Landing site on the Aucilla River here in Jefferson County. And we looked at, for control, John pulled samples of contemporaneous ceramics, Pensacola culture ceramics, from several sites over in Escambia County around Pensacola Bay. Now, in addition to comparison of the elemental samples of the Native American materials, for the XRF phase of study, John and I were both also kind of curious about European materials that were coming from the Governor Martin site and from the Luna settlement site in Pensacola. The reason is those two sites, unlike a lot of early contact era sites, we know who was there and when. The Governor Martin site here dates to 1539, the European component of most of it, because that's the winter encampment of Hernando de Soto. It's the one site in the United States that is absolutely accepted. We've got the identity and the time that de Soto was there. And of course, the Luna settlement site, we know exactly when the Spaniards were there. They were there between 1559 and 1561. What John and I did, I pulled 100 samples of olive jar from the Governor Martin assemblage. We did XRF analysis of those sherds against XRF analysis for comparison of the sherds that were coming from the Luna settlement site. Remember, 20 years separate the time of the DeSoto Entrada from the time of the Luna settlement, and the question is, given the fact that Luna has a number of materials that are coming from Mexico, we know that at least part of the actual material culture was manufactured in Mexico. By the time of the Luna expedition, are the Spaniards still primarily supplied from Spain when it comes to materials like olive jar, or have they potentially started doing manufacture of olive jar in the New World in Mexico, and that constitutes part of the Luna assemblage? That's particularly intriguing because there are major differences in vessel form from Martin to Luna. John and I will be presenting a co-authored paper at SEAC about that, but the important thing now is the Martin style, the Soto olive jar, and the Luna olive jar look different. Even though they're both technically early style olive jar, they are different, they have different rim forms, and the question is, are the ones that are coming from Luna different in the location of their manufacture? So what we're looking at here we go. I want to take a look here at some scatter plots that show the results of XRF analysis. What you're looking at here are plots that show the clustering of certain types of trace elements from the collections that we took a look at. On this plot, the red dots are the Fort Walton ceramics coming from the Governor Martin site. The yellow that you see here are from the Bear site, the site, again, that Calvin Jones found the early style olive jar. 1221, our newly discovered site, the Waters Hill site. And the dots that you see here are from the Fort Walton materials that come from the Aucilla River. And the blue and light blue dots that you see over there are the two controls that we had from the sites over around Escambia and Pensacola Bay. Now, if you take a look at this, this is what's intriguing about this sample. Looking at the trace elements here, you essentially have an awful lot of similarity between all of the Fort Walton sites from the Aucilla River west, and not just the true Fort Walton sites. You're looking at a situation where there's also a pretty tight cluster between the materials that are coming from this region, the region between the Aucilla and the Ochlockonee, and sites that are almost 200 miles to the west. However, here in Jefferson County, which is much, much closer in distance to the site cluster that's just to the west over in Wakulla County and Leon County, you've got more difference in the site that is on the Aucilla River, the Fort Walton ceramics that are coming from there, than in all the other samples put together. And when you look at different types of trace elements, the same thing appears to continue to apply. You're looking at a situation again here where you've got this incredibly tight cluster between all of the other sites, the Fort Walton materials from everything from the Aucilla on west all the way over to Escambia, and this one site that's on the Aucilla, it's way on out here. And with each of the different scatter plots that we did, that John put together and prepared here for us, we're looking at a situation where there's just a very distinctive difference between everything else and what's coming from the Aucilla. Now, the implication of that is not an absolute conclusion, but definitely needs some further testing, is that everybody else is using paste sources that in terms of their elemental composition are relatively similar. For some reason, the folks that are over on the Aucilla are using a paste source, or at least are coming up with material that's substantially, distinctively, recognizably different than what you're seeing from folks in the Fort Walton sites further to the west. Now, in terms of understanding what's going on in the protohistoric and early contact period, this pilot study gives us some directions that we can go for additional research that may give us a better understanding about what's going on in this region culturally and otherwise. Taking a look at the OSL dates that we saw a little bit earlier, we have a situation where, at least within the Wakulla site cluster, it does appear that two of the Fort Walton sites at least were occupied at the same time. We don't have dates as of yet from Waters Hill. We hope to in the future, so possibly more than that. And in terms of cultural practice, you have the Childs Mound site that we were looking at earlier, constructed in the Weedon Island period. Their Fort Walton successors appear to be using that site for at least 2 centuries. And then, in the 14th century, you have a shift in ritual activity from Childs Mound, the older site that began during the Weedon Island period, continued to be used for a while by the Fort Walton folks. They're shifting up to the area north of the spring head that you see at the Moai Rock site. And then, based on the European materials found at Childs Mound, at some point during the Mission era, somebody went back to Childs Mound as using it for burial. These sites that we're talking about also do appear to have an identifiable protohistoric component that shows that at least a couple of them are part of the same larger occupation. In terms of the work with pXRF, the pilot study suggests the possibility that yes, in some areas, in some cases, you can identify more clearly pay sources that people are using. Unfortunately, the problem is that all of the sources that we have in this region, not just in the Red Hills region, but the ones that are 200 miles to the west, cluster so tightly it's a little difficult to say with certainty that they are in fact using different sources, even though logically we know they were. But at least it gives us an angle and a new possible technique for understanding where it is that people were manufacturing their ceramics and what sources they were using. And it also suggests that there is something unique and different about the Aucilla. I'm sure everybody who's familiar with the historical documents knows that in the historic period from the early contact period on, the area there around the Aucilla River was a buffer zone between the westernmost Timucuan chieftain, the Ustega, and the Appalachee to the west of the Aucilla River. It is possible, based on this data, that there is in fact some distinctive difference between the folks who are on the eastern side and the west in terms of their manufacture, even if both ceramic types would be classed as Fort Walton. So these new techniques give us some hope of understanding better through dating sites and understanding the source of their material culture, what's going on in the early contact and protohistoric periods, and we are hoping to do a larger expanded study of dates of Fort Walton sites. Currently talking to Dr. Glowacki at the Bureau of Archaeological Research, and we have plans to do a more expanded study of OSL dates from a series of the Fort Walton sites in this area. To be announced, but this information gives us some hope. We've got new data using these new techniques.